you work at Cal.com, or you work on the design system, or I suppose the details aren't particularly important, but you are working on Cal.com.
Correct. Yep.
And you sent me over this Figma file, which I'm grateful for. And I've chosen this screen because it's got a few different sort of decisions that have been made. It's a relatively complex screen as far as the contents goes. But I know Cal.com has quite a black and white visual style.
Yes, it's an infrastructure open source product. So the kind of a lot of the design decisions are made to kind of try step back and not be too opinionated in terms of the visual appearance. You will have people like embedding the Cal product in their in their own sites, and so yeah, a lot of the decisions made are it's very stripped back in terms of like a brand or a color.
And so that's almost a white label approach to visual design.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so would there be cases in this where if someone picked up the product and started to use it, that they would introduce their own branding, or does that not happen?
Yes, they can do that. So you can actually input your own brand color, and that will take over button colors, focus states. The toggle, for instance, will go, rather than being black, will go to the brand color. So you can brand it yourself, basically.
Okay, got you. So yeah, some of my questions might be about monochromatic visual design, but we can keep that in mind. That,
yeah, it's been challenging for sure. Not having or trying to use as little color as possible for certain things. You'll see even like that default badge. That's one of the few instances of color, and we also have a gray label. It has been limiting. But sometimes in a good way.
So I'm going to start with the structure as a whole, I think, because I mean, SaaS applications are generally laid out and structured in a way that if you compare different SaaS applications, they're generally more similar to each other than if you compare websites, for example. And so there might not be a lot of variety to explore here, but I'm curious about this structure in terms of the gray sidebar and then the white main section, especially since you've got a gray sidebar here. And then you've essentially repeated a pattern in terms of this list menu.
Yep.
So it's hierarchical, but I wondered if you could talk through the hierarchy of the screen and how you represented that.
Yep. So I suppose the gray sidebar, keeping everything on the right white is intentional to like have that be the page, the main page, and to try pull once you're in the screen, essentially to try like remove the left sidebar from your focus. So I also didn't want to introduce like lots of lines or feel like it's overly paneled and have this sidebar fit into have an additional sidebar. So the kind of visuals, what I wanted to stand out first and foremost was actually the active inner sidebar here. So this advanced item. So that kind of being the primary piece of orientation, and because we have like these settings here, but we do actually want people to like explore, to kind of move down through these. We've tried to put as few things as possible in the event setup. So like the event setup just contains like the 4 or 5 things that you have to input to be able to create this event type. Everything else thereafter is additional, but we do want people to explore it. So it's kind of just to bring that focus first and foremost to the inner sidebar.
Okay, yeah. So the inner sidebar is this menu you're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that's the reason for the white background, is that you don't want it to feel like it's fading into the background.
Yeah, exactly. And also didn't want to kind of have that, like, I didn't want to feel like there's lots of cards on the page and lots of different surfaces. So even though we're using like borders to contain things, I didn't want to have it feel like there's many cards on the page, or that like just that. Yeah, I wanted to like keep the more white there is, the easier it is for me to draw attention to that advanced sidebar, essentially.
Yeah, okay. And if I can just focus on this selection style, because you've got it here and you've got it behind the advanced option. I'm curious why you went for this rather than an alternative, like, you sometimes see people using essentially a border on the left of the bounding box, for example, or some other way that you might show the selected item.
Do you mean like a border on, if I was to put a border on this n types item here?
Yeah, so you could put a border around the box and not have the background color change, or you could put a border just on the left here, for example.
So
Or you could do some sort of visual connection between this pane and the next pane. So I'm just curious, are you aware of why you went for this background shape?
Yes. Well, so generally what I've tried to do is have, there's obviously an exception here in terms of the cards, but borders, anything that has a border around it, or like a border with a higher contrast, you can interact with. So borders are reserved. So we have like this, we have like this default border color for inputs. And I wanted that whenever you kind of see that border, you're encouraged to interact with it or input it. So we have inputs with a border, like the buttons will have a border. Obviously, there's a slight contradiction in that, like the containers, the outside container is a border, but it is slightly subtler in color, and ultimately that is an area that you're interacting with. So borders are kind of used somewhat intentionally to kind of be clickable areas, whereas the surface ones, obviously, like they're still navigation, they're still clickable, but it's not something that you're like inputting.
Yeah, okay, so it's
interaction patterns.
So the background color sets it apart from things with a border around them, which is interactivity.
Yeah, exactly. So interactive, yeah, being like buttons and inputs, and then just surfaces being used for maybe things like navigation, tabs, sidebars.
And this is I suppose this is a particularly polite challenge. I'm not calling you out because I think it's, you've made the right choices here and everything. But for example, the primary save button up here.
Yep.
There might be a border on that technically, but it's still using a solid sort of background color.
Yeah.
So I assume you didn't want to try a border only sort of primary button.
No, I think the full background primary color kind of overrides any of those subtleties I've sort of discussed in terms of, because they are quite subtle in that I'm saying like an input has a border and it's interactive, but I think it's probably a valid point in that could have potentially, if we weren't using black and we had like a blue, I think, or some sort of color, we would be able to put like a slightly darker border around it and actually achieve that. But I guess in one of the limitations of the black-white color palette. But then at the same time, I think just that full color does visually override any of those other kind of subtleties, and I think it still just becomes the most prominent thing on the page.
Yes, I shouldn't turn this into a podcast, but I find this sort of thing interesting because it's a good example of when you have these rules like, okay, things with a border around them are interactive, and then as you're saying, you get a full sort of really visually heavy button.
Yeah, and it
overrides those rules. Yeah. And even though it is contradictory, like you're saying, it's not really an issue. Everyone sort of understands that primary looking element is interactive. So.
Exactly. Yeah. There's rules that then get broken very quickly, but obviously, yeah, it still seems effective.
I just realized I skipped over. So we've got the cal.com icon on the top left because I'm trying to start top left and go to bottom right. Yep. And it felt fine to skip over that because that's a pretty standard sort of branding approach. I'm curious now about the search icon, which I just recognized. Was there a reason you put that alongside the logo or the title and not its own sort of section in the sidebar?
The main reason is that it's actually triggered by Command K. So when you hover on that little search icon, I don't think I have it in the screen, but when you hover on that, it shows you what the shortcut is. And the intention is really to teach people to use this shortcut for search and not to actually primarily basically go over there to click it. So you would hit Command K, it comes up in the center of the screen. You're probably relatively familiar with that pattern. So yeah, it got positioned there. It'll probably potentially get moved, or at least that Cal logo is probably going to get moved. That was kind of like an early decision with an early product where you're kind of like trying to stamp your branding a little bit. That's likely going to become like an organization switcher where if a company uses Cal, they'll have their logo top left and they'll be able to switch between others. So kind of a decision made in terms of like the early stage of a product that will mature. I know you said it is a common branding pattern, but the more a product matures, the less common it becomes. Obviously, I think if you're to use Linear, Notion, any of these products that they don't put their branding, they don't need it. And Cal will be at a point where it doesn't either.
I got you. Just focusing on this area, I've realized as well the alignment here. The cal.com logo is essentially between the icon here and the edge of the bounding box here in terms of the horizontal alignment. I'm curious about that, if that was intentional.
It was intentional, yeah, and that was one of those things, I guess, that's just done sort of by eye. That, like, if you were to get up and close and get your rulers out, like everything else in that menu should be aligned. Or there's actually another drop-down menu that pops out, but it just, when it went all the way to the edge, if it was aligned with like the active state. So if you kind of go here, or sorry, if I were to pull it out here, and then it kind of it feels right when maybe event types is active, but it probably didn't feel as right when maybe one down here was active. It just felt a little bit too far over. So now suddenly that feels off, even though it's technically aligned.
Right? Yeah, so it's more optical.
Yeah, exactly. So just by getting that balance, given where it was positioned. Obviously now when it's been questioned, move it again. And
no, you can tweak those things forever and not get it right.
Yeah, and I feel like if I was to align it off the edge of that icon, maybe that would sit right. But now it's at like, not at 4 pixel. I kind of move things in 4 pixels or 8. So, but that could be it. Yeah, thankfully that logo is probably going to be moved, and you're going to, I can ignore what is now bothering me.
Well, I noticed the same thing, just as a call out to the back arrow on Design Workshop. That isn't left aligned with, that's sort of centered as well with almost with the padding on the selected item.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a hover state on that icon.
Yeah.
And it should be when everything is left aligned here. It sits. So actually you can't, I'm doing rulers there, so you can't see, but basically maybe I can do it this way. It just aligns on the left side. It doesn't,
that's one of my sort of hardest things to work around, is that if you have an icon with a hover state or some other button, if it's only got a hover background shape, then actually aligning it is visually quite tricky, because it's only really neat once it's hovered, which is a rare state. So
and also another consideration is this component, this kind of sidebar component, is reused. It's part of the design system and it's reused in other areas. It also has the option to have that secondary text with or without. So some of the positional decisions in there are made kind of with the consideration that it actually it sits in 3 places, and it kind of sits slightly differently, so you can actually have it without the description here. And so then that kind of works in other places. But yeah, it does result, this is kind of some of the issues with design systems and reusable components. You make decisions that kind of look okay in 3 places but not perfect in any one.
Yeah, it's sort of a lowest common denominator.
Yeah. But
no, that makes perfect sense.
I do think increasing that space here is actually, and at least aligning the that text perhaps with the inner item, it could probably build a little bit better, I think. But it's still, you still have the issue of this not being out. And we could obviously introduce some padding on the left, and then kind of try get that icon to align, but it probably just never did.
No, I'd be surprised if any company that's working on a complex product has solved this sort of issue.
And now you end up with this, and that feels off. So you kind of, sometimes you just have to, I guess, decide that this top section and the sidebar below don't have a relationship in that, to that extent. And just don't, I guess you try, give up on trying to align them, and you try and make them look good on their own.
Yeah. I think it's practically the only way to approach it, probably.
I did have designs, I think, before where this left arrow just actually sat completely out of the kind of left alignment. It kind of hovered just left. So it was sort of absolutely positioned, I suppose you would say. So that the text just lined up on the left and that icon was out there. But I think it was it was just causing issues then. Obviously, when it becomes responsive, we don't have that space, or we go to smaller screen sizes, we didn't have that space on the side. It was a compromise, I suppose, once, going back and forth with engineering. So that just it now lives where it does.
Yeah, no, I think it's all compromises all the way down, right? Design.
Yeah.
So, and I hope I'm not making you uncomfortable with these choices, Ciarán.
No, I think it's great. And it's been a long time since this was done. So even looking at it now, I'm thinking, why didn't I do that differently? And then as I kind of start to explore it, I don't get to a solution, and probably a time constraint kicks in, and you're like, okay, this is good enough for the V1, and V2 never comes.
Yeah. We sort of touched on it briefly there, I think, because you highlighted a section of the design. And this is something I've always been interested in because it happens in the to-do list app things. So I think what I would always try to do if I was designing a screen like this is I would feel the need to make the content in the right-hand section of the screen, past this sort of divide, line up or be associated with the content in the left-hand side of the screen, this sidebar. And so what I'm talking about specifically now is this design workshop title is not vertically aligned with either the event types title or the cal.com title. I am curious about the decisions there, and I think I saw a hint of it because you had this top section selected at some point.
Okay, so I guess, I mean, you could look to obviously align we could pull this up here and then try get that aligned. Possibly everything just felt a little bit too compact at that point.
Especially with the left and right padding versus the top and bottom padding, I think that's it does start to feel a bit uneven.
But you can, I mean, for sure. I'm going to just remove that. That's obviously something that's not properly part of the component. So you could get my rulers out, which you're not going to see as I share my screen, but for sure there's a possibility to do this, right? Like these are all kind of now sitting. There is more alignment now in terms of, like, if we make this one active, right, you'll kind of see that everything is actually sitting. The event types, the event setup, the other thing, they all do align across the top, right? And the title, cal.com, and the design workshop, and they're the same, ultimately the same font and probably the same size. So they're kind of aligning along the bottom. And I think it does align, but I don't think it looks better. You might disagree. This might sit better. You might prefer this already. You might think that, like.
No, I agree with you 100%. I think that the left and right padding you've got is basically necessary to make it feel, the whole thing feel proportional. And so I think just what you changed there, I can see how it basically has these knock-on effects, this butterfly effect, where you'd have to change the proportions of the entire app, essentially. And it would feel completely different.
As soon as you get that compact header at the top of that page, then this title area, everything below feels like it needs to become very compact. And I think there's probably a point at which you have to, and I would definitely very often start like that, where I am aligning the top of the, each panel, you're kind of aligning them and it's sitting together. But I think there's obviously a point at which it just doesn't, you have to decide that these are separate things, and that we have our columns, and I suppose I can show the grid. You're probably not going to see it, but there's a vertical alignment in those columns, and that probably is what I would stick to first. And then the vertical alignment becomes something that is probably done maybe a little bit more by eye, or maybe even starting. This is from the Refactoring UI book in terms of their tips, where they say, like, start with more space and take it away. So start with a lot of space and then reduce it till it looks right. And I think you can kind of get, I think so long as if this title was like very close to this icon or the logo in terms of its horizontal alignment, it would probably feel off, because you'd be like, it's nearly aligned, but it's not. And I guess the fact that it's maybe just enough off that I don't I don't look to align them. My eye isn't trying to like draw that line across and then feeling like it's off. Now other people obviously might feel differently about it, but I think they're all just off perhaps enough that it's not quite upsetting, but I could just have become used to it.
No, I think until I started looking more closely, I didn't notice it. I think it feels natural as it is, and I suppose that's all we can aim for. Like we were saying with the optical alignment of the titles, some things don't feel right sort of mechanically, but actually they feel right when you look at it holistically.
Yeah.
Yeah, much better. And like I said, this question was inspired by Things, which is a extremely well designed app. I think everyone agrees that Cultured Code are doing good work, and their sort of central section, just like here, the title of that doesn't line up with anything in the sidebar, which feels odd when you look at it, but you don't notice it until you start to question it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I might jump around a bit more because I was trying to go through it in a bit more of a structured way, but it's clear that we could talk about even just structure for probably 6 hours solid and not cover everything. So there are some things that sort of jumped out at me when I was glancing at it earlier. Well, one is more of an interaction design or potentially a visual design question, which is these toggles.
Yeah.
As far as I know, the iOS sort of standard is to have the toggle on the right, and you have got space for it. You've also got a toggle up on the right here for hide from profile. So I'm curious about why you went for the toggle on the left.
It's a great question because you'll probably see in the exploration for the redesign of this section, it moves right. The reason it went left is, if I might get you to follow me over.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of settings. Basically, whenever you toggle any one of these on, there's kind of any amount of inputs that can appear below depending on what this setting is. So it can be anything from 2 to 5 inputs. There's a bunch of different things that can appear here, and I'm trying to remember the decision behind putting this on left, because it was definitely intentional. I mean, one thing is that when I feel like if I pop all those on the right, for some reason it becomes harder to, I feel like it might become harder to tell at a glance what I've turned on and what I haven't. Because not everything has the toggle. But as I go through it, it probably feels like it should be on the left. And if you follow me over here, we're looking at exploring this a little bit further so that each set of settings has its own kind of more clearer grouping. And then the toggle is now on the right, obviously, and you can see when you toggle it on, the settings appear below. So we are moving towards that. So it's, to be honest, you probably pointed out like an imperfection in the design that there may have been justification for that wasn't strong enough. It could have been that it felt easier to glance to see what was turned on and what wasn't.
I think these full borders or these full containers do make a difference with understanding what's switched on and what's not. This feels more structured to me, even though the other design has dividers.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that. I think it's a very subtle effect, which I think is part of the reason that you're sort of not remembering the obvious reason you did it. It does seem to be subtle.
The other reason for the going to more solid sections and less of this divider look is that actually each of these sections can potentially be disabled. So you might have, it could be disabled by a setting that you set somewhere else, or it could be disabled by basically an admin can turn these things on or off for you, and you could be able to see it. So when it's in its own section, it becomes then clearer we can kind of make it opaque, or we can give it a slightly different visual appearance, which is just not really possible here, not as easy to add the kind of context around it. And also, it being an open source project, anyone can add, technically any developer can propose a new setting and it can be added in, and this happens quite frequently. And it having its own kind of little block and section makes it much clearer for engineers or for people to know, like, how should it look if I'm adding a setting and it has a certain amount of inputs. It just becomes much clearer. They kind of have that little block. It becomes kind of more of a like reusable kind of block that they can be added in. It becomes easier for us to like order things, that kind of thing.
Got you. It seems like that modularity is sort of quite a big driving force behind some of the decisions.
For sure, yeah, many of them. Like I said, it is open source. There's many times more developers than designers, always will be, and trying to just like have a clear way for people to be able to add things is it's key.
One of the things I was curious about, I don't bring this up because I disagree with your decision, but because I see a common pattern that you haven't quite followed, which is that you've got this, let's take this apps example. You've got apps in a certain color or a certain brightness, and then you've got the sort of subtext. And normally when I'd see this, I'd see it in the style that workflows and OneActive are, where they've a designer has put more effort into emphasizing one and de-emphasizing the other. And so apps and OneActive here are quite similar colors. I'm curious about why you made that choice rather than this choice below.
That would probably, so the fact that it shouldn't say OneActive there, there's probably just like a little copy issue. So the gray one would just be if there was zero active. If you've none active, it just becomes a little bit more de-emphasized, I suppose, a little bit less in focus.
Does that happen with the sort of the subtext up here, like this event does not repeat?
It should. It should, as you pointed out. Now, whether that passes accessibility, we've just updated our tokens, and it's probably not carried through to this component. So
it could just be a sort of a mistake in the Figma components.
Yeah, but the intention there would have been behind, I suppose, something, basically a section that you're not necessarily using, just becoming a little bit less prominent. Obviously, the execution is
right.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it sounds like you're sort of wrestling with a few different states it could be in, which obviously complicates things a bit more.
Yeah.
In terms of how you represent those visually. I'm just seeing what else I notice here, because I think we've covered most of the things that jumped out to me at first. One of the things I wanted to point out, which is not necessarily I need a sort of a justification for, but you've made this text slightly lighter for the inactive components. I am curious about the choice there, given that you already have this active selection style.
Yep. I suppose it's just a little bit of a, further de-emphasizing. So we have this in our tokens, we basically have like emphasized text, and then we have default text. And we use it in the sidebar as well, where we just have, there's a very slight difference in shade, but I think it gives an overall, it's probably less effective on this component when we have the description in, but it would have been a decision made for these when they don't have the description. So we could have in other areas of the app, we basically have the same thing but no description, and so it just has that same effect of this in the sidebar, where there's a very subtle but further de-emphasizing, and it's also something that you can kind of, it becomes more obvious then maybe on hover. So when you might not notice it, between the event types and the booking thing now, but when you go to hover through these and you bring the background in and the text color comes up slightly, it just gives a little bit more feedback. Again, very subtle.
Yeah,
it's possibly something that could even not be done and may make no difference, but it's just a little bit of an effort to bring more feedback to hover states.
Makes sense. I'm curious, looking at all these icons that are used for both the sort of main sidebar and this settings list.
Yeah.
It seems like you've gone for a all icons approach when it comes to these sorts of menus. I'm curious if you had any trouble finding icons for each of these concepts here or elsewhere in the app?
For sure. And I think it's fair to say that actually a lot of the icons don't well represent what it is, like the apps one, for example. So yeah, absolutely. We used an icon set called Feather Icons, which I think was extended by an icon set called Lucid, which I think is basically similar style and with a larger set. And we actually only recently brought Lucid into the application, which now it does open up the possibility to search for more icons. We could possibly look to find better ones for these, but it was for sure it was an issue. We don't have custom icons. Generally, most things we choose for Cal have to be open source or are open source. So the font would be open source, the library would be open source. So does make it a little bit more challenging. Yeah, for sure. It's an issue.
And speaking of icons, over here on the right, you've got these sort of meta actions, let's call them. I don't know what their technical name is, but you've gone for icon only rather than having some text in there to say what each does. I'm curious about that choice.
Yeah. We do have a hover state on these, which you can see is probably not properly active on the right border. But yeah, when you hover on those items, you will see what's behind them. Obviously not great for mobile, but the majority of our users will obviously see this in desktop. In mobile, it's actually a more menu which shows full text. So you will, when you're on mobile, you'll click it, you'll get a little drop down and it'll have the text alongside it. So I mean, yeah, the kind of most obvious reason for first resorting to this was space. And I guess they're kind of, delete, copy link are possibly the more commonly needed ones here are probably a little bit more obvious. The embed one is probably not. The preview is not, but the tooltip, I guess, should help with some of the issues here.
I assume that because there's not a space issue here, but I assume there might be in other screens.
Yes, yeah. And this is again like a likely expanding list of things.
Oh, yeah, right.
I think as well as this this title can be as long as you like.
Yeah. I have another question about this section. Before I do, I've just noticed that there, and maybe it's just an oversight, but the bin icon down here has the lines in the middle, and the bin icon up here does not.
Good catch. It is an oversight.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to make sure that wasn't intentional, because that would have been an interesting one to dive into. Like, what do the lines represent? You know? Yeah,
probably made two different decisions at two different points in time. Yeah.
No, I mean that's how even major there was that sort of viral post about all of the button styles in Steam. It's very easy to design these things at separate times and make them look different.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I think I would probably choose the one with the lines in the middle.
And why is that?
I feel like at a glance, it looks more like a trash can. When I think of a trash can, especially like the one with a lid, I feel like I see that metal can. I see those lines. When I do it without, to me, that looks like it could be a pot.
Yeah, if you want to cook something, you can click that button.
Yep, exactly.
I think I'll make this my final question, because you've given me enough time already. This section at the top right, you've got these divided lines between sort of subsections. Generally, I avoid divided lines between subsections that have hard lines already. So this save button and this button group, and I'd argue this toggle as well. So I'm curious what led to the divided lines being added.
Oops, good question. I'm going to remove them just for... Probably it was how this item on the left sat. So right now when I remove those, I don't know if you want to maybe zoom in a little. I'm zoomed in a little bit further. I'm just going to remove the hover state from this. So let me just bring that back. So I would say, so I don't particularly like the spacing between that toggle now which feels a little bit further away from these buttons. This is kind of like button group than the primary button and the button group. So this kind of space here and this space here, not something I'm particularly comfortable with.
Yeah.
The dividers, I feel like give a little bit more balance between these sections. That toggle area has a background on it when you hover. Again, just to give it like that same visual, it takes up the same visual space as the buttons. So they're like 36 pixel high. That toggle area is the same. So if you kind of move anywhere across the top of this, it's just, you can click that whole area as the same kind of click area. That like, so yeah, you know what to expect. Then also we have other scenarios where there's other content that sits left of these button groups. So sometimes there's avatars that sit there. And this actually happens on the previous page where you see the list of event types. We have this kind of exact same pattern where you can actually, you have these same actions, and then we have the avatars of the users that are part of that event type. And then particularly when those avatars were in there, and when we had button and then button group and then the avatars, just because they're that bit smaller, they felt like the things didn't kind of sit nicely alongside each other. So it kind of gave these areas where you can put something in, and it feels like there's your primary action area, that your kind of multiple actions, and then whatever's on the left. Sometimes it's a toggle, sometimes it's an avatars, and you just have these more defined areas. And it felt like it created more flexibility in terms of being able to drop something in there and everything feeling spaced right, rather than having to kind of move things around.
Yeah, once again, it's what you said about the if a component has to work in various different places.
Yeah,
you sometimes need to make decisions that seem slightly stranger in isolation.
To give you that context, so it was actually, so it's here, so it's that divider should be there. So there's actually a divider, obviously on the right of this, basically.
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense. Does it look perfect? Probably not.
Does it ever look perfect? Probably not. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there.
No problem. Well, thank you for going through all that. It definitely is very interesting to have it kind of picked apart, especially so long after making a lot of those decisions. Definitely time for also a revision.
It's always time for a revision, and I think it was far more interesting for me than it was for you. I'm sure you've been staring at this for too long. So thank you for taking the time.
No problem. Appreciate it.
Stop this.